for joining us for our seminar with Dr. Jessica Ridgley. Dr. Ridgley's passion in medicine is utilizing nutrition and manual therapies to improve overall health and your well-being. She believes strongly in educating patients and utilizing a hands-on approach to improve health. So tonight's seminar, Sugar on the Brain, Diabetes, and Lifestyle, will discuss the impact sugar has on your brain and your overall health. Please remember, you can type your questions into the comment section and we will ask and answer them at the end. And now I'll hand it off to Dr. Jessica Ridgley. Thank you.
Hello, thank you for joining us tonight. Mainly the discussion is going to be on type 2 diabetes. Sugar on the brain was kind of just a catchy phrase, but we will be talking a little bit about that. I'm Jessica Ridgley. I'm a DO, and I'm also board certified in integrative medicine, as well as board certified in neuromuscular medicine and osteopathic manipulation. I work at Skyridge Primary Care in the Lone Tree Clinic. And I put my number there in case you guys wanted to get in touch with us. So let's get started. Okay, is that gonna? Okay, having problems getting it to go forward. There we go. Did it. All right. I can't diabetes today. I don't make me diabetes today. I don't feel that way. I know a lot of you probably do from time to time. And I know a lot of my patients come in feeling this way. And I hope tonight I won't make you feel the way this dog looks. So here's our plan. We're going to discuss the rising numbers, which I think a lot of us are already aware of, but I think it's important to understand what we are seeing in our culture today. And then we're going to discuss why do we get diabetes, or what is the physiology behind going from our normal healthy selves to suddenly having this issue with insulin resistance, and what do we do about it? We want to consider the long-term effects and how not doing anything about diabetes is going to worsen the problem, and why we don't want to get it, and also why we want to do something about it even if we have it. And then the other thing is, how can we stop it? How can we try to kind of put the brakes on this kind of continuous downward spiral that can be this disease? And then I'd like to discuss some potential tools, and I will discuss a little bit about medications, but most physicians have that well under wraps. And so I'm going to talk a lot more about diet and lifestyle, as well as exercise and some actual natural things that can also be helpful to us. And these have all been well studied and scientifically shown to be helpful. And I will be giving amounts and that kind of thing, and concerns if there is something or reasons you wouldn't want to take something. So if you do want to write things down, I do recommend having a piece of paper and a pen. All right, so what are these numbers? The numbers currently, as of the last couple years, is 530 million people worldwide. That is quite a large number, considering that is, we have 7 to 8 billion people in the world. 530 million is a lot, and it's a lot to treat. It's affecting over 10.5% of adults age 20 to 79 in the United States. The highest numbers, especially here in the United States, is either Hispanic, non-Hispanic Black, Native Americans. And I didn't put this down because that's not the highest numbers, but I do find that Asians who take on a standard American diet do seem to also get it more frequently than Caucasians. This number is definitely increasing in young adults, which is why we kind of need to nip it in the bud. And when we're talking about cost, it's $327 billion in medical costs and due to lost work and wages annually per the CDC. All right, so what are the risk factors? These seem pretty straightforward, but I don't feel like they're that straightforward. Some of them are and some of them aren't. For one, obesity. In our society, we think of obesity as calories in, calories out. That's a lot of what we get told. And it is so much more complicated than that. And if anybody is telling you that, then understand that it's not just that. And it is much harder to manage because it has to do with a lot of the things that also affect type 2 diabetes. So when we're looking at trying to stop that downward spiral, then it's not that it's impossible by any means, but it does take a dramatic shift in lifestyle, and it's not just calories. Sedentary lifestyle is pretty simple. It's easy to stand in front of the T or sit in front of the TV and watch something that's your favorite show instead of getting out there and actually exercising. And we will talk about exercise and what is the recommendations for that. So immediate family history does play a factor into it, but I am going to introduce a new term to kind of get this on, get you thinking about this, about genetics and family history. And it is more commonly found in 45 years or older. Race predisposition is definitely a factor, and that's, like I talked about, was the Hispanics, non-Hispanic, Blacks, and Native Americans. All right, so what is this disease pathway? I'm actually really excited about this webinar because I think that it's easy to to throw out these terms, especially in medicine, and not really ensure that our patients truly understand them. And I think to be able to control and do something about it, you have to understand it. So I'm going to get a little bit into the physiology of this disease, and I hope I don't get too deep. If there's any questions, I'll be more than happy to answer it. So when we're talking about the disease pathway, two things kind of happen, and then there's these underlying things that also happen. For one, we have dysfunction of the beta cells in the pancreas. So the pancreas produces insulin. It's the beta cells in the pancreas that produce that insulin. Now, if you are even to the point of being in the pre-diabetic range, there has been a statement that I've seen, and there is some scientific evidence to this, that about 50% of your beta cells are now no longer functioning. And that's kind of scary to think about, but you can still manage and still reverse things even with that amount of damage. So that's very important to know that the beta cells have the insulin, and if you are having dysfunction of the beta cells, you're not going to have as much insulin output. So when you eat something, the sugars are not going to be taken up by that insulin as quickly. And then the other problem is actually in the tissues. It is the receptors for insulin being resistant to actually taking up that insulin, and therefore you can't get the glucose into the cells that it needs to be in. And that's a problem from multiple factors, because now without that glucose, you can't go through the energy pathway and create the molecule that's important for us to just survive upon. So, but what's underlying this is where we start with kind of high glucose in the blood, and calories definitely play a factor into this. There's also other factors that come into it, such as nutrient deficiencies, which I'm going to get into a little bit further on. But high glucose in the blood is kind of our starting point, and that's where we're going to kind of take it. And when we have high glucose in the blood, we have development of certain things. We have development of inflammation. And inflammation is important, but it can also be too much. And so is this increased radical oxidation species, which is that ROS. Now, that ROS is something that is very important to our system. Our bodies need it to a degree. It helps our immune system take care of pathogens such as viruses and bacteria. It is also important from a signaling pathway. But when we look at inflammation and the radical oxidation species, we want a nice little fire that's in our fireplace that warms us and keeps us nice and comfortable. What we don't want is this raging bonfire that can suddenly turn into a wildfire. We don't want something that we can't control. We want a little bit, but we don't want too much. And what these things do is they actually create something called advanced glycation end products. So when we have high glucose in the blood, it creates this inflammation, then it creates these AGEs, which is what we call them. And AGEs are something that can be developed in our system. It can also be something that we eat. So if we overcook food, especially like high heat grilling, broiling, frying, roasting, it can actually create this on the food itself, and we can ingest it. And it does a very similar thing. Now, we actually have receptors for these ages, and the receptors are found mostly in, let's see, here we go, heart, lung, skeletal, muscle, vessels, and neurologic cells. And they are actually called the RAGE receptors, or the receptor of the ages. And these can actually, we have the receptor for a reason to actually get rid of them. So it's not completely abnormal, but as we have increased glucose in the blood, we have increased production of these radical oxidation species, inflammations, creating these ages that then causes continued destruction of the beta cells and decreased sensitivity in the tissues for the insulin. And so that's kind of a very brief kind of physiology pathway of the disease. And, it gets a little bit more involved in that, but I think it's a really good idea to just understand how that happens. All right. So when we're talking about these risk factors, now obviously we talked about these risk factors of obesity and sedentary lifestyle and family history, but it is, as always in medicine, a little bit more complicated than that. So I wanted to talk a little bit more, and I really liked this slide because I felt like it showed a lot of how things play into it. So there is an element of genetics, and we are going to talk a little bit more about that genetics of type 2 diabetes. However, it is not the cause. It can add to the likelihood, but it is not the cause of diabetes. And then we have something called mitochondrial dysfunction. So what is a mitochondria? Mitochondria are those little powerhouses in each cell. Every cell in our body has it. We have to have that to actually produce the energy molecule that keeps us alive. So through inflammation and radical oxidation species or nutrient dysfunction, which is a huge one, nutrient dysfunction can cause mitochondrial dysfunction just for the mere fact that if you don't have enough of each product along the line, along this conveyor belt to create this energy product, then we can't create it. And now we don't have what we need. And that's called mitochondrial dysfunction. And both the genetics and the mitochondrial dysfunction add to metabolic memory, which we will add to. And that's kind of the metabolic memory is kind of that downward spiral that can happen in any disease process. Then we're talking about gut dysbiosis. And I do have um, a prior webinar that I did on gut health and inflammation that goes into a lot more detail than I'm going to go into tonight. But gut dysbiosis makes a huge factor in the inflammation. So if you don't have the appropriate bacteria to make certain things, it can cause inflammation and can lead to where you start to have chemicals leaking through the gut layer, and you can start to become more sensitive, and it just creates this kind of long-term pro-inflammatory pathway, and it can actually change how your genes express themselves. And we're going to get a little bit more into that as well, not too deep, but a little bit. And then we go back to these things that we talked about before, which is the inflammation and the radical oxidation species. They feed off of each other and they create both the epigenetic changes or the changes in the gene expression. They also it adds to that metabolic memory. It also increases the radical oxidation species, which just feeds each other. It's just kind of like that, wood in the fire. And those then create the ages that we were talking about. And all of those can actually block certain nutrients to help kind of further mitochondrial dysfunction and change the genetic expression. So when we're talking about metabolic memory, we are talking about how our genes kind of express themselves and also the inflammation response. And so the messenger RNA, which most people have kind of heard that term because of the COVID vaccine, but the messenger RNA is what the DNA produces to send out communication to the rest of the cells. So you start to have these messenger RNAs that are not sending out the appropriate things. And then we have this mixed game of telephone. All right, so that's kind of what we're looking at as the risk factors that kind of add to this. All right, so what are the effects long-term of diabetes and why we need to stop it where it's at? Well, when it comes to the brains and the nerves, any kind of disease can cause increased cognitive decline, but diabetes is one of the worst. It actually can change neurologic pathways and can lead to Alzheimer's, even if you don't really have a history or a genetic predisposition towards Alzheimer's. It can definitely lead to dementia. It can lead to plaquing in the arteries of the brain, so then you can have stroke. And then high sugars in the bloodstream causes issues with the sheath of the major nerves, and it's called a myelin sheath, and it breaks that down. And so then you start to have neuropathy. And when you have neuropathy, it starts out in the feet, but it also affects the nerves in the brain as well as the spinal cord. And then we also have the liver. So liver is a big part of where glucose is developed when we're fasting. And it is important, but it can also become a little bit of an issue when we have type 2 diabetes. And we get this fatty congestion that happens in the liver that can lead to liver breakdown and cirrhosis. Now, a lot of people attribute fatty congestion to obesity, but that's not exactly true. It is really the underlying effect of inflammation. And I've had people I would consider the skinny fat that have that fatty congestion, even though they are not considered overweight. So it is very important to make sure that you're aware that this comes from inflammation and it's just kind of this continued pattern. So in the hearts and the arteries, we have plaquing that builds up that leads to cardiac disease, potentially, you know, having heart issues, also definitively hypertension for sure, because anytime you start having plaquing in the arteries, you don't have the ability for the arteries to kind of expand and contract, which would be normal function for the body. And then you start to develop hypertension. Then you also have issues with eyes, which is the macular degeneration and the retinopathy. Kidneys are kind of like the dam when it comes to diabetes. It's like the overflow. So when nothing else in the body is able to manage that glucose, it basically is left to the kidneys to just put out the rest of that glucose. So you'll see an increase in need for urination and that kind of thing, which also gets you dehydrated because it takes water with it. And this stress on the kidneys over time does cause further issues, and you can start to lose other things like proteins and things like that. So kidney dysfunction is definitely an issue and can lead to the point of dialysis if it is not well controlled. When it comes to skin, we can get wound healing. Wounds in diabetics are much harder to heal than when we're looking at wounds in a person who does not have diabetes. And I just call that because of the sweet blood. It's like the bacteria have the ability to feed off of that glucose if it's not utilized. And that just increases the infections, and it also increases the likelihood that that wound is going to stay around for longer. When we're talking about muscle, that's where the number one thing that takes up glucose in our body is muscle. So when we're talking about that insulin resistance, muscle is one of the main areas, and that becomes an issue where our muscles can't take it up. We can't make the energy molecule that we need to, and then we start to have fatigue. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the nature versus nurture. And this is always a point of contention in a lot of things because we like to blame things on genes. And there's a lot of things we can blame on genes. I will definitely get that. However, in the case of diabetes and actually quite a few of our chronic medical diseases here in the United States, it is actually more of that environment or that nurture that's happening. So what is the actual underlying percentages of nature? So if you have one parent that has diabetes, you are 40% more likely to get diabetes. And if you have two parents, you are 70% more likely to get diabetes. And that seems kind of like a little kind of a dim prediction, but there is a lot more that environment has to play into it. And the question I like to ask people is, what are those things that you grew up with that you know are not healthy? What habits did you have? Um, you know, was your family, did they like to exercise? Did they eat healthy? So a lot of times how we develop these habits are really difficult to break as we get older. And for a lot of times we don't really understand that they're that unhealthy, because it's actually been found that families, despite the genes that could be and cause a predisposition, that if they're eating nutrient dense and anti-inflammatory foods, that the likelihood of developing diabetes is small. And this is where I kind of said the word before, but I kind of wanted to introduce the name epigenetics. And epigenetics is the study of how the things that we do, the foods that we eat, the way that we, go about things, how much we sleep, how that actually causes the change in our genetics and how it actually expresses itself. So our genes, it's not like a 1, 2, 3 thing. It's not like, okay, you have this gene, it expresses itself and then it causes that. That gene can express itself in multiple different ways. And just in how it chooses to start and stop, where it expresses itself can be completely different from one person to another. And that's the role of epigenetics. And I kind of wanted to state something in this that I had picked up, and it says alterations in DNA methylation. So when a DNA expresses itself as methylation, can result in obesity, but it can also be the cause of obesity. So how it methylates itself can be what expresses it this way, or it can actually be something where the obesity creates the methylation process through inflammation. And then DNA methylation sites, or that area that it expresses itself, that is associated with obesity, can predict a future risk of type 2 diabetes. So that is definitely something where we do need to kind of work really hard at kind of having a better diet overall. And so that's epigenetics. I'm definitely planning on going into this a lot more in my next one on cancer, because it really plays a huge role in that. So I just kind of wanted to introduce it now as far as what that is, and the fact that just because our family has something does not mean that it is saying that we're definitely going to get it. All right. So I know that a lot of my patients probably feel this way from time to time when I'm talking to them. And definitely when people who don't have diabetes feel this way when somebody's trying to tell them about their diabetes. So, all right, so let's talk more about our diet and how this plays into things. And I'm going to also at this point go into a lot more questions that I get from patients in regards to diet. So let's talk about the diet don'ts first. So high sugar. And I think most people know that. I think that is one of the number one things that we hear. If you're diabetic, you need to be low carb. It's many times not that simple, but when it comes to sugar, it is that simple. I tell people not to eat more than 40 grams of added sugar in their diet on a daily basis. And for many people, this is actually a really hard number to get below. Sugar is in so many things that we get off of the shelves at the grocery store. So if you're not eating a whole food diet, you have to be really good at reading labels, especially with sauces and other things that you typically wouldn't expect it to be in. They put sugar in breads now because we just have a sweeter palate. And so more people just eat more sugar. And so you actually have to change your palate to be okay with eating lower sugar, but it's super important when it comes to diabetes. So processed foods, it's hard to get away completely from processed foods, but there's better processed foods and not so good processed foods. Crackers are not a good choice. The certain pastas, that kind of thing. But there's some things that can actually be really helpful in our day-to-day lives, and you can make those decisions when it comes to processed foods. But staying away from processed foods for the most part is going to be your best bet. And then we talk about white grains. I have said this in the past. However, I'm going to say it again. We do not absolutely need grains in our diet. This is something that we started having in our society about 10,000 years ago. And 20,000 years ago is when we really started to see the most significant shift in our genetics. And so our genes do not require grains. Can they have some decent nutrients in them? They absolutely can, but they are also higher in calories and not as efficient when it comes to fiber as you would get from fruits and vegetables. So you definitely don't need white grains. So if you're going to do grains, I highly recommend doing your more nutrient dense grains, such as your sprouted breads and things like that. Brown rice, sweet potatoes over white potatoes, that kind of thing. Fried foods. This goes back to those advanced glycation end products where if you overcook food, you are going to have more of these, as well as when you fry foods, it's with oil, and oils can denature at really high temperatures. So fried foods in general are probably not the best idea. They taste really good, but this is definitely something you have to limit just in general from everybody. High animal fat. So fats are not per se bad. There's bad fats and there's good fats. With animal fats, more often than not, we are cooking them. And so it can change them and it can make them more inflammatory in general. So you want to be very careful when you're talking about your animal fats. Dairy is the same way. Um, dairy does have some good nutrients. However, too much of it can definitely be inflammatory in nature. And then you have dried fruits. Really, the dried fruits is more along the lines of if you are eating fruits and you dry them, it's so much easier to eat like I'm gonna take apricots. I like apricots. I could eat like 20 apricots if they're dried. Whereas if they weren't dried, I'd probably eat 3. Very calorically dense, and they do have good nutrients, but you're way gonna overeat the fruits and have very high sugars, which everything in moderation. So that's where dried fruits can come into a problem. And then a really huge one is trans fats. And trans fats are these fats that happen when you are sauteing something or cooking something. Um, it is something that you find in a lot of processed foods. For example, olive oil, which is actually a good fat, can become bad if you cook it at too high a temperature. And then that good monounsaturated fat now becomes a trans fat because you heated it too high. And now it becomes inflammatory instead of anti-inflammatory. So that's actually a really good example of a trans fat. Most of the time you find them in processed foods. When we're cooking, if you do want to saute, I do recommend using a coconut oil, an avocado oil, or something of that nature. All right, so those are our diet don'ts. Like these are the things that like you can kind of just say we really need to try to get away from. And then here are diet do's, and that is a lot of vegetables. Vegetables don't just have fiber in it, they have micronutrients that we haven't even began to describe all the different micronutrients and what they do for our body, but most often than not, it's something good and anti-inflammatory. So we need lots of vegetables and we need a moderate amount of fruits. So the amount of fruits and vegetables that is recommended in an anti-inflammatory diet is around 7 to 9 servings. And most people, when I say that, especially my patients, their mouth drops open and they're like, I could never do that. So let me explain what a serving is so you kind of understand that. A serving of a fruit is a lot of times just the fruit. Berries, it's like a half a cup. Beans count, and that's a half a cup. Nuts count, that's a quarter of a cup. So all of those are ones that a lot of people don't think about. And then you have like your cauliflower or your cruciferous vegetables, your broccoli. Those are going to be about a cup, whether they're cooked or uncooked. Your squashes, your carrots, and your peppers and onions are typically about a half a cup cooked or a full cup if not cooked. And lettuce is usually a handful. So whatever you grab that handful and you put it on your plate, that's about a serving. So when we're looking at that, it's not quite as daunting as we think when we hear 7 to 9 serving, but those are very important. And then seeds and nuts are good. Seed and nut oils can be somewhat inflammatory if used for heating and that kind of thing. But eating seeds and nuts is actually good for you. Pumpkin seeds have really good properties, sunflower seeds, that kind of thing. Now, they're also higher in calories, so you do have to be a little bit more careful with those. And then high omega-3s. The omega-3s are super important. I am going to give you the link to my nutrition basics, which talks a lot about omega-3s and why they're important, but also about a lot of other things. But omega-3s are super important, and we do not eat enough of them. And we can get them from vegetables, fruits, seeds, and nuts. However, we can only get a certain type. And we also need these other two types called EPA and DHA, which we do find in either algae, because algae is where the fish get it. We find it in fish. We find it in grass-fed beef, not grain-fed beef. We find it in wild meats and pasture-raised chicken, or eggs that have from chickens that have been pasture raised and are able to eat the bugs and different things, that seeds that they would normally eat. Legumes can be very good for you. They're very high in protein and have a lot of good nutrients to them. And then going back to the whole grains, not absolutely necessary. We do like them and they are tasty. But if you're going to have grains, you want to make sure it's whole grains. The recommendation is really no more than about 2 servings of grains per day. And then healthy protein. Now, I've really kind of been on a kick in talking about protein because I think that that is a huge problem in our society, where our standard American diet seems to be high in protein, but then we try to modify that and become healthy, and a lot of times the proteins go by the wayside. So I like to make sure that people are getting enough protein, and I do talk about this in my nutrition webinar. So I'll give you guys that information if you guys want to look at that. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about glycemic load versus glycemic index. Now, the glycemic index is what the American Diabetic Association still uses. I don't completely agree with it, and I will explain why. Versus the glycemic load, which is a little bit different, and you can kind of see. So this is the glycemic index right here. This is where'd my thing go? This is the glycemic load right here. So with glycemic index, it's basically just saying this is how many sugars are in this. And so when you look at glycemic load, or glycemic index, I'm sorry, when you're looking at glycemic index, then a lot of people that are trying to decrease those carbohydrates say, oh, I can't do fruits. And fruits have tons of nutrients. And so I think it's really important to understand that you can have some fruits, because you need to look at the breakdown of the product. So in the glycemic load, it takes into effect how it's broken down. So the higher amount of fiber you have in the food, the slower the sugars break down, and so the glycemic load becomes lower. So for example, it said it actually on the glycemic index, it gives it a green to pizza, but it actually gives it an orange yellow for the glycemic load. Or for example, down here, you have honey, which is like in that orange yellow range. But if you look over here, because of the way the enzymes and everything break down in honey, it actually gives you a green in the glycemic load. There we go, right there. And then, so another one is, for example, sugar, which is kind of interesting, 1 tablespoon. It actually gives it a green. It still doesn't mean that you can eat more than that 40 grams per day, which if you look here is a little bit less than 4 tablespoons. And then if you look down here, like watermelon has tons of nutrients in it. It's very, very high on the glycemic index, but when you actually look at the glycemic load, it's actually in the green range. So I like to explain the glycemic load versus glycemic index because I think the glycemic load is a much better way to follow. It also allows you a lot more ability to get those foods that are really healthy for you. All right, so I wanted to talk a little bit about fad diets because we hear about diets all the time and I get a lot of these questions. So I wanted to talk about some pros and cons and where we can go wrong with some of these. The thing that fad diets can help with is they give us a specific direction. A lot of them have good recipes to follow, so it makes it a little bit easier. But they have good things and bad things that we do need to take into consideration. So, for example, keto diet, which has been popular on and off for years, is low carb. It is low carb and it can be very helpful. It also can be helpful to the brain because the brain likes to feed off of ketos, and it's not an overall unhealthy diet unless you eat really high fats, which can also cause you to consume a lot of those advanced glycation end products. So you have to be careful with that. Now, if you were to follow something more like a South Beach keto or a healthy keto, like a healthy keto, you actually still get those 7 to 9 vegetables per day. And you can still do a little bit of berries, even if you are in um, ketosis. So I did the keto diet for the better part of 9 months. I always got the amount of fiber that I needed. I loved some of the little things that I made up. So it's possible to do it. But you still have to follow these diet basics where you aren't eating fats that are inflammatory and foods that are going to increase those glycation end products and that kind of thing. There's also intermittent fasting. So intermittent fasting can be very helpful. It is very good in helping to decrease caloric intake, which pretty much all the studies have found that our bodies actually do like that slight negative caloric amount. It actually shows that it can extend life, it decreases insulin resistance and multiple different things, not a severe caloric decrease, but just a slight one. And so the intermittent fasting does help with that. The thing about the intermittent fasting is that if you're going to eat the way you've always been eating and that habit that you have is unhealthy, you can still eat unhealthy. And it doesn't mean that you're still getting all the nutrients you need and that kind of thing. So you still have to have a healthy diet if you're going to do intermittent fasting. So Weight Watchers, that's a common one. It's been around for years. It's tried and true, it's proven. However, it does give you a healthier direction and it does reduce your calories because it gives you these point system, but you can still make bad choices within the point system that doesn't allow you the nutrients that you truly need. So it doesn't always ensure that you're getting everything that you need. And I have found people who are still very low in protein on the Weight Watchers diet. So let's talk about the vegan diet. The vegan can be extremely healthy. It is very nutrient dense. It has great amount of fiber. However, it is typically low in protein. If somebody, I mean, you can make sure that you get enough protein, but it is actually kind of difficult and you have to pay close attention to your diet to get the amount of protein that you need on a vegan diet. And it can also be high carb if not done correctly. A lot of times people will go to those carbs for that energy source, eating pastas and things like that, which are not very nutrient dense, and then you are losing your nutrients. Then we also have the paleo or the Whole30. I'm actually a big fan of the paleo and Whole30, partly because it takes grains out. It is nutrient dense. It can be a little too high in proteins and animal products. It cuts out legumes, which can actually be pretty healthy, but it is low in inflammation. And it is one of those that gives you a good amount of recipes. So the paleo is in a way like the keto in that you have to make sure you're still getting your fruits and vegetables, nuts and seeds as naturally and as whole food as possible. All right, so this is my nutrition basics, basic truth and dispelling myths. That is the where you would go to get it is https://vimeo.com/74976134. So that really delves into like the actual amounts that you need, regardless of what diet you choose to follow. All right, let's talk about exercise. Hugely important. So, exercise has actually been found to reduce type 2 diabetes, I believe, by like 58, yeah, it was 58% in 4 years if you exercise a minimum of 150 minutes per week. And that is a minimum. Like they will talk about you need to exercise 150 minutes per week, but that is actually a minimum amount. Like you need to get that or above that. And it's not just cardio or just resistance exercise or just flexibility. It's all three of them are very important. Cardiovascular exercise, if you get into that cardiovascular range for at least 20 to 30 minutes, will actually increase your uptake of glucose for the next 24 hours. So it actually kind of gives that pancreas a little bit of a break. And because your muscles and a lot of your tissues actually turn on those receptors to bring in glucose without needing insulin. So for any diabetic, whether it's type 1 or type 2, exercise is hugely important. For when it comes to resistance, you can do cardio all day, but if you're not developing that muscle so that you have more muscle that requires more glucose, then it actually you have this constant requirement to maintain or increase that cardio. So resistance actually helps to improve overall balance of the body, as well as ensure that you're getting consistent amount of utilization of the things that you eat. So, and then flexibility is important for so many different reasons, and we don't do enough of it in our society at all, which is why I do osteopathic manipulation, because I see a lot of joint pains and things like that, which could actually be prevented if we taught our kids how to do flexibility early on. So I don't want to leave that out, but those are probably the biggest heavy hitters is your cardio, your resistance, and your flexibility, and getting more than 150 per week. So, all right. So let's talk about diabetic and nutrients. So you can kind of see this, but I'm just going to say it kind of briefly as we go through it and then talk about a few points. So boron, not something that we think of often, is that then if that's deficient, then that actually raises our plasma insulin levels. So, and that can actually lead to insulin resistance. If our calcium has a low intake, it actually has an association with a high metabolic syndrome. So that epigenetics of turning on and off genes can actually affect some people more than others. If you have a deficiency in cobalt, it can lead to type 2 diabetes. You can actually use chromium to help improve blood glucose, insulin levels, and your cholesterol. Iodine, which we think of when it comes to the thyroid, if it's deficient, actually alters our ability for glucose control. Iron in deficiency impairs our glucose metabolism. Magnesium is my favorite. It's literally one of the first things I get people on. 70% of people are low in magnesium. After that is zinc is probably the next one. But magnesium is hugely deficient, helps in multiple different things. It can help in sleep. It can help in muscle relaxation, anxiety. So magnesium is a big one. That's probably one of my favorites. And that one, actually, the studies have shown that it can decrease your A1C by 0.5. And the dose that they typically used was 400 milligrams. My preferred form is magnesium glycinate. Selenium, if you treat, can actually decrease that oxidative stress, which leads to that decrease of the radical oxidation species, leading to more inflammation in those ages, and decreases metabolic syndrome. And then treatment with zinc also decreases oxidative stress, and you can actually decrease blood pressure. Now, what I will say about zinc is people, especially in COVID, decided they were going to get zinc and it's going to help their immune issues. Zinc, you should not take more than 50 milligrams per day, and that includes what you're getting through your diet. So I don't recommend more than 25 milligrams on a daily basis, because if you get too much zinc, it can cause decrease in copper, iron, and a bunch of other minerals. So talking about some of the things that are on the left side, that high protein intake is super important. 30% of calories is the recommendation and improves glucose control. Now, I talk a lot about protein to my patients, and the reality is that proteins are our foundation. If we are not getting our 9 essential amino acids, we cannot make the other 18 amino acids that our body requires. So we have to get enough protein. And the basic, before we're talking about adding in exercise and other things, is 1 gram per ideal body weight of 1 gram per kilogram ideal body weight. So if somebody's ideal body weight is 150 pounds, that's about 70 kilograms. You're talking about 70 grams of protein per day. Increased fiber with water improves your insulin sensitivity. And then vitamin D, and making sure that your vitamin D is in the appropriate range, actually helps beta cell function in the pancreas. And that's huge. All right, so we have a few natural helpers that I was going to go through. I'm going to have some notes just so I make sure I hit all of them. So cinnamon, I love cinnamon. The main one that's been studied that's been found to be useful is Ceylon cinnamon, and that is Ceylon. The cassia cinnamon has kind of had mixed reviews when it came to scientific studies. The recommended amount is 1 gram daily, and that's about a half of a teaspoon of cinnamon. The Ceylon is not as spicy as the cassia, which is also helpful. It decreases fasting blood glucose levels, as well as improving oxidative stress. So they're with the radical oxidative species, and it can decrease cholesterol. So that's a win-win. Probiotics. Probiotics goes back to that dysbiosis that we were talking about. And there's a lot of things that probiotics do, including make most of our neurotransmitters. Like 70% of our serotonin is made by certain species of probiotics. But in this case, dysbiosis can lead to insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes, mainly because of decreased production of the branch cell amino acids. So those are your non-essential amino acids that are made by the essential amino acids. But if we don't have the help of the special bacteria, we can't make what we need. And then either way, we're either not getting enough protein, we don't have the type of probiotic, and it can decrease our function of the BCAAs. So that's actually really important. They've found that utilizing probiotics can actually decrease that A1C by 0.5%. I'm sorry, 0.5 points. So just to give you an idea of what the A1C is, anything from 5.7 to 6.3 is pre-diabetic, and 6.3 and above is diabetic. And so you have this range about 0.6, and this can actually help to decrease it by 0.5 for some people. And it decreases inflammation. Some of the probiotics that can be helpful, and this is where you might want to write something down if you're interested in this, from the bifidobacterium, which is one species, you have Bifidobreve, Bifidolactis, and Bifidolongum. From the lactobacillus species, you have Lactorhamnosus, Lactopericaceae, and Lactoplantarum. So those are the main ones. Honestly, of those, the Bifidolongum and the Lactorhamnosus are probably your heaviest hitters from just all points from health. So probiotics are huge. The next one really surprised me. Aloe vera really surprised me. I was looking things up to see what could be helpful. Aloe vera came up, and I found out that aloe vera can actually decrease your fasting blood glucose by almost 46 points. And it can also decrease the A1C by 1 point over time, and that's taking 300 milligrams twice daily. The thing that you need to know about aloe vera is that it can cause low blood sugars if you're on other medications that can cause it. So you have to be careful. And then, so my next one is alpha lipoic acid. This is extremely powerful antioxidant. It is helpful in multiple diseases and just in overall health. It can prevent beta cell dysfunction, indirectly decrease production of glucose from the liver in a fasting state. It also decreases radical oxidation species. It helps increase NRF2, which is one of your body's biggest antioxidants. It can repair proteins that have been oxidized. It decreases age production. So lots of different things, and it can improve type 2 diabetes neuropathy. So that's really big. And the dose for alpha lipoic acid is about 300 to 600 milligrams daily. And then you have American ginseng, which is a very interesting one. This is in the botanical world, this is an adaptogen, which means that it actually helps to regulate cortisol and improve overall stress. So this is a really nice little botanical. You do have to be a little careful with it. It requires about 3 grams per day for helpful in type 2 diabetes. It can decrease post-meal glucose by about 20%. It decreases or increases insulin secretion, increases cellular response to insulin, so you now are not as insulin resistant. It can decrease the A1C by 0.3 at about 8 weeks, and it can actually decrease your systolic blood pressure by 5.5 points. Now, this one does have the potential to interact with certain pharmaceutical medications, and you absolutely do not want to take it if you are taking warfarin. So on some of these, like the alpha lipoic acid, you could take that. That is not going to interfere. The aloe vera, the American ginseng, and the berberine, you have to be careful with these if you're on other medications. The probiotics and the cinnamon, you should be fine. So the berberine is also a big one. That does decrease the fasting blood glucose up to about 40 points. It can decrease your A1C by sometimes between 1 to 1.5 points. It does decrease triglycerides. It decreases insulin levels in the blood. In the fasting state is what that means. And then it has similar effects to metformin. But it can interact with multiple medications. I know most people know about the whole grapefruit thing and how that can interact with certain things because it causes certain interactions with some of the breakdown products of the liver. Same thing with berberine. So you have to be super careful. I would not recommend berberine if you are on other medication. But it is a very interesting one if you're not, and it's about 300 milligrams 3 times daily. So, all right, so starting to get towards the end here. I want to talk about metformin because I really think metformin is a very interesting medication. I've seen the worst of metformin, and I do want to point out that if you are on metformin and you are getting dehydrated because you have a GI illness, diarrhea, anything like that, you have to be very careful because it can be a double-edged sword. But metformin is actually a really interesting medication. The main thing that it does is it decreases the glucose output from the liver in the fasting state. So it just kind of helps the pancreas from having so much pressure in that fasting state. And it also increases tissue sensitivity to glucose as well as sensitivity to insulin. It helps decrease the glucose absorption from the intestines, which is the side effect that if somebody has is usually that it causes a little bit of loosening of the stools. So that is the number one side effect of metformin, and that it is because of that. Some people can handle that and some people can't. About 20% of people do have a little bit of loosening of stool with metformin. The interesting thing I find about metformin is that scientific studies have shown that it is the only medication I know that improves the gut microbiome and actually stabilizes and helps the probiotics. It stabilizes DNA, so you are less likely to have methylation of DNA that you do not want. So therefore, it does have a somewhat anti-cancer benefit. And it also most recently has been found to decrease the incidence of long COVID if taken during COVID. The study that showed that if you did it for about 2 weeks surrounding COVID, that it decreased the incidence pretty significantly for long COVID. So I found that to be super interesting. But a lot of people resist me when I talk about metformin, when I start to see them in the beginning stages of diabetes. And honestly, I have to say that it's a medication that one, intrigues me, but two, actually has a lot of good benefits. And then when we're talking about other diabetic medications, so the ones that I'm going to give you the ones that I really like and the ones that I'm not a fan of. The sulfonylureas, which are these down here. Oh, it's not coming up. Hold on a second. These sulfonylureas, which is going to be your glipizide and your glyburide and those kinds of things. Those are the most common ones. They can decrease insulin, cause you to be hungry, and make you gain weight, which is creating this whole cycle. Insulin can do the same if you're a type 2 diabetic. Sometimes it's absolutely necessary, but those actually have a propensity to make you gain weight. So some of the ones that I actually really like is Farxiga and Jardiance. Farxiga a little bit more than Jardiance, but those have actually been found to have cardiac protective effects. It's been found to have renal protective effects. So those are super interesting. Those are some newer ones. I really like those. Especially if we're looking at people who do have cardiac issues or kidney issues, those can be helpful. The GLP-1 receptor agonist, this is kind of an older slide, so it doesn't have the semaglutide or AKA Ozempic or the Mounjaro, which is tirzepatide. Um, I I think that those are very compelling medications. There has been a finding that because of their side effect, I mean, the reason they make you lose weight is because they make you not want to eat as much. But some people have had issues where their stomach just doesn't continue to work even after taking it. And so that is a risk. The other risk is that when it's breaking down fat cells, it can also bring down muscle cells. And then that goes back to kind of a pattern that we really don't want. So anybody who decides to take those or their doctors put them on it, I highly recommend participating in resistance training at least 3 times a week to make sure you're not losing muscle mass on these medications. But I have seen some really amazing things happen with these medications as well, and they can be super helpful. You just have to be careful with some of the more serious side effects of those medications. All right, Santa baby, please slip a working pancreas under the tree for me. So hopefully we don't have to get to that point, and hopefully this talk has been helpful for you and kind of guiding you in ways to go and minimizing and improving diabetes. These are my references, and I will kind of leave these up if anybody is interested in looking at any of those.
Thank you, Dr. Ridgley. As always, that was very informative and very thorough. We do have a few questions, so I'll just go ahead and ask them and give you a moment to answer.
Okay.
So should we take the natural helpers as a preventative measure?
That's a really good question. I think alpha lipoic acid is a really interesting one. It's a very powerful antioxidant. So that could be a preventative one that I would recommend. The probiotics for sure. If you like cinnamon, there's no harm. I put cinnamon every night in my nightly drink. So I drink decaf coffee at night, and so I actually put cinnamon in there just because I like it. But there's also that extra benefit. So there's some things that you can use for that. Magnesium definitely, because 70% of people are low in magnesium. So those would probably be the 4 I would say could be used as just overall health and wellness and prevention.
Is there caffeine in decaf coffee?
There's a
Only
tiny
a
bit of
little?
caffeine. It helps me get my notes done.
Good. Will taking my medicine correct the glucose level?
That depends on the type of medication. And even with taking medication, you can still have that underlying kind of swirl of the oxidative species causing the AGEs, causing the inflammation and leading to more beta cell dysfunction and insulin resistance. So even taking the medications, you can still have worsening of the diabetes. So although it will help help to prevent it worsening as quickly, it is not going to stop that process without diet and lifestyle changes.
Okay. Are people with diabetes at higher risk for other medical conditions?
Yes. Diabetes as a whole affects the entire body. It increases your risk of stroke. It increases your risk of cardiac disease. It increases your risk of neurologic dysfunction, which can affect both the gut as well as it can affect pain in the legs and hands. It can cause you to have more wounds. It can cause you to have severe fatigue. So overall, diabetes can cause a lot of other dysfunctions of the body.
Okay. So are organic diets any better for diabetes than regular foods or non-organic?
So that's a great question. There is a lot of chemicals out there, and I'm probably at some point going to do a talk specifically on environmental toxins, and this would be in it. Toxins can affect how your body functions. And there are certain foods, such as like spinach, kale, berries, and apples, that are very highly affected by the chemicals that are put on them. And then we are very highly affected when we eat them. So you don't have to be on a strictly organic diet, but if you are going, but I do recommend following the environmental working groups, Dirty Dozen, Clean 15. If you're not going to go completely organic, I recommend at least following and making sure that anything you eat that's in that Dirty Dozen list is in the organic, is bought organically.
Okay, good to know. What's a good protein for a vegetarian or vegan diet?
So vegetarian can typically have whey, and whey is a complete protein. So is collagen. So my vegetarians, you can do, if you're okay with it, you can do whey or collagen, which are complete protein. For vegans, it is much harder to make sure that you're getting all the essential amino acids. And there are some essential amino acids that are just harder to get in general, without eating some sort of like whey, collagen, or dairy type or animal type product. One specifically that comes to mind is cysteine. Um, for vegans, I actually recommend getting as a complete protein as possible from that's in the vegan range. And there's actually this app called the Chronometer, which does not sound like a food app, but it is a really good food app. And if you did just a couple weeks of that, you'd be able to see, because it actually tells you if you're getting enough of your essential amino acids. And if you're not, then you need to focus in on the ones that you're not getting. For me, cysteine was one that I wasn't getting, and that comes from some legumes, but it also comes mainly from like pork products and things of that nature. I knew I wasn't going to get enough of it, so I just started supplementing it, and I can say it made a difference in the long run. So you just have to figure out what you're missing if you're going to adhere to a vegan diet and go from there. And even a vegetarian, it's a little bit harder. So it's a good idea to kind of watch your protein intake and make sure you're getting those essential amino acids.
Could you take those amino acid powders that we've seen maybe trending on our social medias?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Like for me, I just took N-acetylcysteine, and now I get more than enough cysteine. But yeah, you can take it through the capsule form. You could take it through like the BCAA. Well, BCAAs are not an essential amino acid, so I shouldn't actually say that. BCAAs are very helpful, but you could actually get your essential amino acids through a supplement form if you find that you're specifically low on certain.
Okay. So talking a little bit about products, what product options do I have to monitor blood sugar? And then part two is, do I need to monitor my blood sugar if I'm pre-diabetic?
I don't recommend doing it if you're pre-diabetic. Honestly, my big ones are diet, lifestyle. I typically put my pre-diabetics on magnesium, or the cinnamon if the magnesium doesn't seem to be working. And so I don't really recommend it. If you are diabetic, you should check it. Usually kind of the easiest way to check it is just to do a fasting blood glucose in the morning and make sure that that's not significantly elevated. I love the ones like the Freestyle Libre and the Dexcom. I like the Dexcom a little bit better. And I actually have a person who gets to try them out because she's a diabetic educator and she likes the Dexcom a little bit better. But I find that it's not as well covered under some insurances. But I think those are great. And one of the reasons I really like those is because even just a person who, is just at beginning stages of diabetes, you can start to see what types of foods are causing you to get higher or causing you to not get high enough. And it's really interesting because I've had patients come back and be like, I had no idea that this was causing me a problem. It's not a carbohydrate, but for whatever reason, it spikes my blood sugar. And my typical theory on that is that it's likely causing some sort of inflammation for that specific person. but anything that they find that spikes their blood sugars, they can actually start to kind of limit in their diet, and you can get really specific on what you can and can't have. So I do like those Dexcoms and the Freestyle Libres.
That's interesting. So if I eat a lot of candy, chocolate, or sugary foods, will this cause inflammation? And how can you test for inflammation?
So sometimes inflammation is not always detectable by labs. You can just assume that if you eat a lot of that there is inflammation and underlying processes that are causing your body to not go down a very good path.
Okay. And aerobic or anaerobic exercise, which one is better for blood sugar levels?
So your aerobic exercise in the moment is going to get your blood glucose lower, because we were talking about cardio exercise actually can help you uptake glucose in your system over around 24 hours. However, your anaerobic exercise and the development of muscle tissue actually increases your likelihood of handling it over the longer term. So you do need a mix of both. I typically recommend doing doing about 3 times a week of cardio and doing 2 times per week of resistance, something along those lines, and always adding flexibility in with every workout.
Great, thank you. It doesn't look like we have any other questions coming in. You can connect with Dr. Ridgley at Skyridge Primary Care or visit healthonecares.com. And do you have any closing comments, Dr. Ridgley?
No, I just hope that this is, well, I hope that this is really helpful for the listeners to really kind of get a grasp, hopefully live your healthiest life.
Thank you.